The question then is, can we survive it? That's the first question. Is survival possible? Are we going into a dark age? Are we going to find this planet in the middle of the next century has been reduced to a population of several hundred million people as it was in the 14th century? Largely through starvation and disease. That's what we face unless there's a solution. All right, is a solution possible? So government has to take a leading part in creating the solution. Fine, that's understood. That's also certain. But the question is, the big question, what can we do about it? Is this something which we must face by sitting back and wondering if Santa Claus is going to bring relief in the sack on Christmas time? Or is this something which we as individuals can shape? Is this something we can affect? And because, and here's where the real thing comes, if we have the power to influence the course of history as individuals, and the choice is between the doom of civilization and recovery from the grip of this crisis, then each of us has a corresponding moral responsibility to muster from within ourselves those capacities which enable us to do our part in shaping the course of civilization. Now, under that rubric, I say the question is, what kind of news is newsworthy? Because if what I'm saying is true, that you represent as an individual person a force which can change the course of history under conditions of crisis, then what kind of news do you need? And the kind of news you need to do your job as an individual, first to understand what's going on, what's happening to the world, and to locate yourself in such a way you can say, well, here's what it is I can do under these circumstances. On the idea that if enough of us each do our particular part, we get out of this mess. Then the only news that's worth having is news which performs those functions, which enables government, which enables you as an individual and so forth, better to understand what is happening to this planet, to understand what the developments are that are shaping the course of history, and finally to indicate to you the facts which you need to look at so that you can judge what it is that you might be able to do which can contribute to bringing about a solution, an escape from the collapse of civilization. This is no pipe dream, this is no fantasy, this is real.
So, welcome to reality and welcome to today's show of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, April 16th, 2022. Today marks the 100th anniversary of the Rapallo Treaty signed between the Soviet Union and Germany. There's a interesting and important history, and we're going to be talking about that here in a few moments, but you just heard Lyndon LaRouche talking about what he called what is newsworthy. We're obviously in a circumstance, and everybody is aware of this, that thinks about what they are hearing in the daily news reports and what they're seeing in the daily behavior of the American political class. We're in a situation that demands a kind of leadership and a kind of forthrightness on the part of the citizens, which we last saw in this country during the period of the late 50s and 60s. And although that's a very storied time, we're now in a circumstance which requires far more than was required of people at that time. We clearly face the possibility of an impending thermonuclear war, probably provoked through the expansionist designs of NATO, and not through Vladimir Putin, and not through Xi Jinping of China. Yet facing that reality and confronting it from a higher standpoint as to what should be the true interests of humanity as a whole is a real challenge. Last week, the Schiller Institute held a conference which was called to create a new security and development architecture for all nations. And I moderated, and our guest for today also moderated portions of that conference. But we are going to take a look at not merely what happened at the conference, but more importantly, where we stand since the conference and how this 100th anniversary, occurring the day before Easter 2022, the anniversary of the Rapallo Treaty, should inform the ways in which that new design for a new security and development architecture might be shaped in this most adversarial of times. So with us today, we have Harley Schlanger, who is the spokesman for LaRouche organization. You've all seen him here doing various things, and we'll go right to Harley and see what he's got for us today. So Harley, welcome.
Okay, Dennis, thank you very much. Well, this is truly a day that should be remembered. It was April 16th, 1922, that a treaty was signed between the Soviet Union and Germany in the Italian town of Rapallo that could have made a dramatic difference to events over the next 20 or so years. Now, I'm going to look at this in a specific way from the standpoint of Lyndon LaRouche's approach to tragedy and history, including tragic drama. That is, how do we understand what is the cause of tragic events? And by understanding what causes it, how do we make sure that we avoid going in a direction which makes tragedy inevitable? If we allowed the present policies of the Biden administration, the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson, the NATO policy to continue, there will be World War III, which could very easily be a nuclear war, which would end the human race on this planet. It's not inevitable, and it's not that we're doomed to face that and therefore should seek some pleasure in the last remaining days or weeks or months that we have. But it requires a sober assessment. And I think by looking at the events of 100 years ago, in the context of this question of tragedy from Lyndon LaRouche's standpoint, it will help give people the kind of insights necessary, not just into history, but into how each of us think about history. Because if you're going to become a historical individual, you have to think about history in a different way, not as a succession of events or a series of dots that were connected, but as decisions that were made shaped by great forces. And what were those forces and how to deal with them? Now, I want to draw on, as I said, Lyndon LaRouche's, one of his writings. It's titled Shakespeare as Scholar, U.S. Politics as Tragedy. This is from September 2003. And in it, he starts out by saying the subject of history is the nature of man, that which differentiates man from beast. Tragedy is not what happens to one person, not even what happens to a society. The idea that the tragedy is about a tragic hero who may be the person who makes a mistake, becomes corrupted, or is killed, or fails to act when needed to be, and that's the tragedy. No, that's the result of the bigger picture which caused the tragedy. And in this, the question, you have to realize that when Lyndon LaRouche is talking about tragic drama, he's drawing in this paper in particular on William Shakespeare, but also Friedrich Schiller, and the conception of man that is explicit in the writings of those two great dramatists and historians. Now, in looking at this, he starts by talking about the case of Julius Caesar and how Shakespeare shows his murder and the events that follow that eventually lead to the collapse of the Republic, the emergence of the empire, and then 400 years or so of degeneration until the empire ultimately collapses. Now, the murder of Julius Caesar is not the tragedy. The tragedy is that the society is self-doomed, as you see from a number of aspects of the interactions of the various characters. And this is something that Lynn is emphasizing. When you look at a historic event, you have to look at the big picture. Now, what he says in this is that in the tragedian, the Shakespeare, the Schiller, they shift the focus away from what Lynn calls social interactions in the small, and instead to focus on, quote, historical unfoldings of processes of entire societies, to direct the focus upon the great forces of those histories as such, unquote. And then he makes a very startling comment. He said, quote, history can be known only to the degree it is relived as an impassioned reality. Real history is recreated on the stage of the audience member's living imagination. And so it's possible, he says, in a great drama, to bring the individual into that historic process in a way that causes them to rethink everything about their life. And he says, the final point I want to emphasize from this article, and I'd encourage people to read it. This will probably be included in the second volume of the LaRouche Legacy series when it comes out, and his writings on history, drama, culture, and so on. But he says what you're dealing with in these kinds of stories is a conflict between a, quote, ruinous old tradition, unquote, versus the need for the sublime. And what's startling about what he says here is he says that every person has within them this desire for the sublime, as Schiller defines it. That is, for some connection to eternity, that you know that there's something more important about your life than your daily passions, your needs, your desires, what you do, but that you leave something behind. At the same time, you're paying your debt to those who lived before you. And it's this idea of striving to have some higher purpose that exists in every person. And he said that there is this passion for an escape to a higher state of organization of national and international affairs, unquote, to be free of the oppression of the present state of mankind. It may not be conscious. In fact, it's usually not conscious, and it's usually that part of you is what's targeted by the media, by the advertising culture, and so on. But it's that passion for the sublime which is necessary if you're going to be able to reverse a direction toward tragedy and toward a durable survival policy for mankind. Now, from that standpoint, we're going to look at the case of the Rapallo Treaty, which in itself was an extremely significant event at the time, but it's barely known today. It's not really acknowledged. This is something that was crucial for Germany. And yet I was looking around to see if there were any commemorations in Germany today, and I couldn't find anything. Now, what happened? To understand this, you have to go back to the end of the 19th century. And again, LaRouche says you have to look at the broader forces acting in history, not the moment. So in understanding this, you have to realize that there was an incredible international struggle at the end of the 19th century between the vibrant economy that was emerging based on the American system, not just in the United States, and the American system was revived under Lincoln, and the Transcontinental Railroad, which led to the explosion of scientific and technological progress that was realized through breakthroughs in manufacturing, industrialization, and agriculture. But this was being replicated all over the world, in Germany under Bismarck, in France, in Russia under Count Sergei Witte, who undertook the development of the Trans-Siberian Railroad project to connect Eurasia with Europe. The Berlin to Baghdad Railroad was another example of this. Japan also was implementing the American system. And each of these nations was experiencing a rate of growth, of real economy, physical economy, goods production, based on improvements in science and technology. So their economies were outstripping that of the moribund economy of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain. Great Britain was still living off the proceeds of the imperial policy, the British East India Company, the free trade policy they imposed on the rest of the world and enforced it through the British Deep Sea Navy, the control of ports, and the control of the world trade and currency with the pound. Now, this was being outstripped, and the British, at least the leading figures in Britain, realized this. They recognized it, and they figured they had to move against it quickly. Now, one aspect of this was the work of a somewhat obscure fellow named Halford Mackinder, who was a geography professor. But Mackinder delivered a series of papers and eventually a seminal lecture in 1904 called The Geographical Pivot of History, in which he laid out something which has come down to us today known as geopolitics. Now, what he said is that the world should be seen as divided into three major areas. One is the Eurasia, or the Eurasian heartland. Secondly, the peripheral, or the outer islands, which included Europe and the United Kingdom and the Indian subcontinent. And then the peripheral nations, which included North and South America, Australia, Africa, and others. His thesis was that who controlled the Eurasian heartland controlled the world island. And the world island is essentially the landmass of Asia, Europe, and South Asia, the Middle East, and with Russia as part of that. Who controls that will control the world island and will control the world. The fear that he was reflecting was the development of the corridors of development, transportation corridors with the rail systems that were being put into place with the American system would eclipse the power of the deep sea navy and the British ability to control trade and finance. And therefore, the British launched a series of operations to make sure that there would not be a viable connection between the major powers of Europe, France, Germany, and Russia, with Eurasia, and ultimately with China and Japan. So the biggest concern was Germany, and in particular, breaking any potential alliance between Germany with France and Germany with Russia. And this is what led to World War I, the Entente Cordiale between France and Britain, and then the Triple Entente when they brought in Russia, after Russia had been crippled by their defeat in the war with Japan in 1905, with the near revolution of 1905, with Russia in a weak state. The British pulled them into an alliance and set the stage for what became World War I. World War I could be seen in a sense as the collapse of the major empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and also the Ottoman Empire. And the British spent a vast amount of resources to ensure that what would replace those empires would be either neutral governments or governments under the control of the British. And this had a lot to do with what happened in the Middle East, with the launching of Zionism, the Arab revolution of Lawrence of Arabia, the emergence of the Saudi kingdom, the Arabian Peninsula under the Saud family, and so on. But most importantly, the events that led to World War I were, again, not the assassination of the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but the intention to pit these empires against each other as collapsing entities and ensure that there would be no threat to continued domination of the British Empire. Now, that's what led to World War I. And the British had spent an enormous amount of time, which I can go through if people have some questions about this, in making sure that the United States would come in on the side of the British Empire in World War I. But after the war, the question then was, what do you do with Germany? What do you do with Russia? Because in Russia, the collapse of the government led to the Bolshevik Revolution and the takeover of power by a communist government under V.I. Lenin. And at the time, Lenin's strategy was world revolution, to deploy Russia's resources to work with communist parties throughout, especially Europe, to overthrow the existing governments there. In Germany, with the collapse of the empire, you had a series of coalition governments that were mostly very weak, but you had the emergence of a radical left and a radical right that engaged between 1919 and 1933 in constant battles, including people changing sides from left to right and right to left. Now, most important, though, was the policy of the Versailles Treaty to punish Germany, to blame Germany alone for World War I, and to impose punishing reparation payments on Germany, which were designed to make sure that Germany would not be able to revive its industry and industrial production. Now, this is the background for what happened 100 years ago today at Rapallo, because the concern of some in Britain was that Germany was being so deeply punished that it was going to have a negative reaction, a backfire potential, which could lead to another war. And so they called for a conference to take place in April 1922 in Genoa with 34 nations. And they gathered there to have a discussion, but there was a big split between the British and the French. The British were willing to give a little bit of leeway on reparations. The French were not. And the French Prime Minister, Poincaré, was insisting that, if anything, the reparations be increased, the payments from Germany be increased. Now, meanwhile, Germany was having trouble with exporting, having trouble producing. The French moved troops into the Rhineland. Germany was very, very weak. And Russia was totally isolated. Russia was in a civil war. There were foreign troops on the borders and in some cases in Russia. And so even though Germany and Russia were both invited to the conference in Genoa, they were in very poor shape, at least on the surface. But what happened is very interesting. Russia, after the defeat of the Civil War, the victory of the Bolsheviks in consolidating the government, Lenin made a shift in policy to something called the New Economic Plan. And he said Russia needs to modernize and upgrade its industry and technology. And for that, it needs to break the isolation. The Germans were looking to Russia as a source of potential raw materials as well as a market for industrial goods of Germany. And so while the haggling was going on in Genoa, the German foreign minister, Walter Rathenau, and the Soviet foreign minister, Georgy Chicherin, called for a meeting for the two of them in Rapallo, which was not too far away. Now, Rathenau is an extremely interesting character. His father was Emil Rathenau, who is credited with building a company called AEG. In collaboration in some ways with Thomas Edison, he built the high technology electric company, basically, which had numerous patents, had advanced science, and his son, Walter, became the CEO of that company. But during World War I, Walter was brought in to be responsible for the industrial production, for the war production for Germany. This was somewhat interesting because Walter Rathenau was Jewish. And the idea at that time that you'd entrust to someone who was Jewish in Germany that important a position had Rathenau's family worried about his security and safety. But he said, look, I have to do it because no one else can do it. And by all reports he did an extraordinary job keeping the German economy running during the midst of this 4-year meat grinder war. So after the war, he was a very prominent figure, and he became foreign minister. So he and Chicherin met, and what they agreed upon was a policy where both countries would cancel the debts of the other. The Germans would give up their attempt to get property that had been confiscated by the Bolsheviks. The Russians canceled the German reparation payments to Russia. They offered each side most favored nation status and agreed that they would. Yeah, that's basically what they did. Oh, also, Germany recognized the Soviet Union, the first major country to do so. Now, what was the response to this conference in Genoa to what had just happened a couple hours drive away in Rapallo? It was furor. This is not acceptable. The idea of a peace agreement which would benefit both countries and by extension would benefit the rest of the world, this was deemed unacceptable by the British minister who was leading the British delegation there, Lloyd George, and by Prime Minister Poincaré of France. They denounced both countries. They said this cannot be allowed to stand. Now, before the treaty could actually be brought into full fruition, there was an event which occurred which ensured that it never would be brought to full fruition. That is, Walter Rathenau was assassinated on his way to work 2 months and 2 days after he signed Rapallo, supposedly by right-wing terrorists who did it because they thought he was signing Rapallo to sign away German interests to the, quote, Jewish bankers. Now, I'm sure, given what we know about the control of the British of international terrorism, going back to the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, for example, the various networks in the Balkans. But just as well, if you look at the left-right terror operations of the last 100 years, what you find very often is foreign hands in the mix. In any case, Rathenau's assassination ensured that the full effect of Rapallo was never realized. Now, what were the implications of that? Well, the reparation policies of demanding a full payment from Germany continued, and to pay the debt, Germany hyperinflated their currency. And we had, as a result, the Weimar hyperinflation, which completely collapsed social stability in Germany, collapsed industry, led to a polarization of society, which had a lot to do with the instability for the next 9 years, that led to the emergence of Hitler and the imposition of Hitler as chancellor. What I don't have the time to go through now, but I'll just indicate to you, is that the choice of Hitler was not the choice of the German people. He never got more than a third of the vote before he took power. It was the choice of the global corporate cartels, especially the banking and financial networks, directed by Sir Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, the Rockefeller-Harriman interest from New York. A player in this was Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, who with Roland Harriman were the two American directors of a bank, the name escapes me right now. I think the Bank of, Dennis will remind me when we get to the discussion. But this was a bank that continuously loaned money to the industrialists who were funding Hitler. A bank that was seized by Franklin Roosevelt's Justice Department in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act. So the choice of Hitler was the same people who were committed to destroy Germany using geopolitics before the war, the people who imposed the Versailles Agreement after the war, the people who celebrated the demise of Rapallo and were more than happy to see Hitler come to power. And in particular, Hitler's finance minister was the choice to run the German economy. And it was Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a British-run monetarist whose policy was austerity. The way they got out of the hyperinflation was austerity, fully crashing the German economy and creating a depression within Germany. Schacht, when he was brought in by Hitler, set up slave labor camps to cheapen the cost of labor to pay for the remilitarization of Germany. And Schacht is the person identified by Lyndon LaRouche as the model for the post-1971 transatlantic economies after Nixon ended the Bretton Woods Agreement on August 15, 1971. Now, the importance of this can't be overstated, because if you look at history as LaRouche advised, the view of the study of the nature of man, what characterizes the Schachtian view of man? What characterizes the view of man of the British Empire, inscribed in the geopolitical doctrine? Well, what is wealth from that standpoint? Wealth is land, it's raw materials, it's control over the population, preferably as peons and peasants who won't organize and are not educated enough to know what's in their own interest. This is imperial geopolitics. This is what we see today with the collapse of the education system in the West. We see it with the free trade system. We see it with the monetarism as implemented by the central banks, the U.S. Federal Reserve among them. The idea that wealth for them is how much you can charge for any product. And if it's too much to produce a product, which it is for them, then produce a fake product, like a financial derivative, a swaption, some form of financial paper, which you can buy and sell. You can bring the suckers in to give you the money to buy and sell. But in the end, the profit goes to the less than 1% who control the process. And this is controlled by the City of London and Wall Street. And that's what Schachtian economics is about. How do you protect the paper value that's held by the leading members of the financial cartel, including insurance companies, including hedge funds, equity funds, and so on? And how do you convince people that it's in their interests not to have industrial production, not to have science and technology, but to have access to the proceeds from the buying and selling of worthless financial instruments, which ultimately, the way the hedge funds and the way the equity funds and the 401ks and everything else work, they stuff your portfolio with these things so that when they blow up, you're the one who loses. But they've made money all along by buying and selling and trading these instruments. That's the fascist economic system that's being defended today by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, by the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and so on and so forth. That's the system of a post-industrial economy, which does not produce enough goods, either in terms of physical goods or things such as food and energy, to sustain a population on this planet of over 7 billion people. And when you hear about the supply chain and the shortages being blamed on Putin, that's the flimsiest cover story that anyone ever came up with, because the collapse occurred long before a single Russian soldier set foot in Ukraine. The collapse occurred sequentially ongoing from 1971 to the present, with key moments being the 1987 stock crash, the 2000 dot-com bubble crash, the 2007-2008 crash of the mortgage-backed security bubble, and then the ongoing crisis from September 2019 in the so-called repurchasing markets, which required the Federal Reserve to step in with tens of trillions of dollars to bail out the speculators while shutting down small and medium enterprises, mom and pop businesses, shutting down industry, agriculture, and so on. Therefore, creating the shortages which enable them to raise the prices today and are forcing millions of people to scramble for a scrap of bread to stay alive. Now, that's the tragedy, that this system has been allowed to continue. Not just continue, but the geopolitical system and the neoliberal economic system that's related to it, because both have their origins in the city of London. This system is what dominates the world today. This is why the Russians and the Chinese and many, many other nations decided they had to make a break with the policy, the funny money policy of the transatlantic region. That's why the Chinese moved from being a cheap labor economy for runaway companies, outsourced companies from the US and Europe, into becoming an industrial superpower by developing their own scientific and technological basis to lift 800 million people out of poverty. Putin is engaging in the same process. The Indians are moving in that direction. And there's a desire for that. Again, remember the question, the desire of the sublime, for the sublime purpose of life, to do something with the life that billions of people wish to leave a better world to their children and grandchildren. And they're looking for that opportunity. Now, the emergence of a China-Russia alliance as a center of opposition to this neo-imperial, neo-colonial, neoliberal, neoconservative policy, the alliance of Russia and China sent a shock effect to the British and American establishment. They essentially said, if you continue to persist in this, we have an alternative system that we'll build. Now, this was, of course, well known that this would happen because some of the establishment types may be thoroughly evil and scummy conspirators, but they're not dumb. And so they were planning over a longer period of time how to outflank the nations that wish to break from this system. And that's what the Great Reset was about. That's what the Green New Deal and the whole climate crisis is about. And when they saw that they couldn't get the Russians and the Chinese to submit to this, yeah, the Russians and the Chinese say, yeah, we want a cleaner environment. But they don't mean what Klaus Schwab means. Klaus Schwab means everyone has to do with less. That's the Davos World Economic Forum plan. And some of you have been told that Xi Jinping and Putin are part of the Davos plan. That's such a silly lie that's so easy to dispense with that when you hear it, you know that someone is just either ignorant or trying to demoralize you. Because when the Chinese and the Russians talk about clean energy, they're talking about clean coal, they're talking about nuclear, they're talking about nuclear fusion, they're talking about increasing the energy throughput of the system. Whereas Schwab and Prince Charles and the Mark Carneys and the neo-Malthusians who control the international banking system are talking about lower energy throughput, lower energy flux density, and a lower world population. And that's the essential difference. Again, how do you view the nature of man? For the Chinese and the Russians, their view is that having more people is not a curse, it's a potential to increase the division of labor in which every person's productive potential is increased to increase the wealth of the whole society. For the bankers of Wall Street in London, the idea is how do we get a bigger chunk of the limited resources in the world? How do we control nations so they don't break from our system? So when you look at the question of tragedy from this standpoint, you see there have been missed opportunities. Rapallo was a missed opportunity. 1989, 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union, was another missed opportunity. The collapse of 2008 was another missed opportunity where Lyndon LaRouche had put forward an economic policy which could have broken us once and for all out of this neoliberal system. Now we're at a final opportunity for mankind. And this is what the Schiller Institute conference laid out last Saturday. Now is the time to move to a new paradigm with a new strategic and new financial architecture, which starts from the standpoint of sovereign nations, not supranational institutions. Sovereign nations that are committed to the development of the skilled labor power of their population, which means education, which means science and technology, as opposed to the Klaus Schwab globalists who say technology is the problem. Wanting a better life is the problem. Schwab actually said that. The reason we have the climate boiling over is because you want more. Well, no, that's not it, because the climate's not boiling over because of what man's doing. They're using, in many cases, faked temperature readings to destroy the science and technology, but more importantly, to destroy the minds of young people. And so when you get to this question again from LaRouche of each person, whether they know it or not, having a right to an immortal life, not that there'll be books written about them and memorials posted to them, but that they can live a life so that in their last breath of consciousness, they can say, I did something good for my children and grandchildren and for the whole world. That's how you avoid tragedy, is inspire in people that sense of their personal destiny. And that's what's being attacked by this post-industrial neo-Malthusian policy coming from the people who want more war. And just a final footnote on that, what's become increasingly clear is that the war going on in Ukraine, which, as we've always said, has nothing to do with Ukraine, but the transatlantic desire to destroy Russia, because they don't want Russia and China to have a potential for a new financial system. This war could be ended tomorrow. If NATO stopped shipping weapons into Ukraine, if Zelensky stopped doing his macho routine and was told, sit down and negotiate a settlement of Ukraine as a neutral country, not in NATO, not in the Russian bloc, this could be settled. The reason it's not being settled is the same reason that Walter Rathenau was killed, that Alfred Herrhausen was killed when he was moving toward a LaRouche solution at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, that you have an evil empire which won't let up its grip. But we have the majority of the world's population with us. We have to bring to consciousness in every person we can this sense of the destiny of the immortality of each individual, and organize nations to act on specific policies that will assure that we can have cooperation for prosperity in the future. So that's the significance of this 100th anniversary of the Rapallo Treaty.
Okay, well, thank you, Harley. And if you've just joined us, we're here in discussing the aftermath of the Schiller Institute conference of last week to establish a new security and development architecture, and as well in commemoration and celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Rapallo Treaty. What I want to do is I want to play the opening of Helga's remarks for last week's conference, just so people have a sense of how we place the present moment in history. And if you saw the beginning of our show, where we had Lyndon LaRouche's short video, what should be meant by the news that's fit to consider and to think about. So if we can have that video now, and then we'll come back, get a comment from Harley about it, and then go to questions.
What brings us here together today with participants from over 60 countries, from 4 continents, is our utmost distress that the very existence of humanity is in grave danger. The aim of our conference is to arouse the awareness of ever larger social forces around the world that because of the danger of the presently escalating strategic confrontation, there could be soon a full military engagement between NATO and Russia, leading to a world war which in all likelihood would mean the annihilation of mankind in a following nuclear winter. The aim of our conference is therefore to demonstrate in the most powerful way that there exists an immediately accessible alternative, a paradigm which can leave that mortal threat behind us and begin a new era of human history in cohesion with the true nature of mankind as the only species known so far capable of reason. That danger of a large war did not start on February 24th of this year. As my late husband, Helga LaRouche, forecasted with prescience in August 1971, after Nixon replaced the fixed exchange rates of the Bretton Woods system with floating exchange rates, that a continuation of this monetarist policy, unless corrected, would lead inevitably to a new fascism and a new world war. And that is 50 years later, exactly where we are right now.
All right, so Harley, you had asked before the name of the bank, and that was Union Banking Corporation. I just want to indicate to people a book, because there are various references that people may want to take today out of today's discussion. And this was a book called The Unauthorized Biography of George Bush, which was printed by our organization, EIR, actually Executive Intelligence Review to be more specific. And here's what they had to say so that people understand. On October 20th, 1942, so this is during the Second World War, the United States has declared war as of December 7th, 1941, and is in the Second World War. So this is almost a year after our declaration of war. The U.S. government, on October 20th, 1942, ordered the seizure of Nazi German banking operations in New York City, which were being conducted by Prescott Bush. So people are clear, Prescott Bush is the grandfather of Bush 43 and the father of Bush 41. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, the government took over the Union Banking Corporation, in which Bush was a director. The U.S. alien property custodian seized Union Banking Corporation's stock shares, all of which were owned by Prescott Bush, E. Roland Harriman, 3 Nazi executives, and 2 other associates of Bush. So there you have it. Yes, Prescott Bush, the father and grandfather of 2 presidents, was in fact running the bank through which funds were being conduited through to Nazi Germany, including after the beginning of the Second World War. A second reference, which is simply just useful for people to have, is an old book called Trading with the Enemy, which also covered this. This is by Charles Higham, who tells a funny story because the reason that he got onto what he called the Nazi-American money plot of 1933 to 1949 was because he was researching the Hollywood actor Errol Flynn and had noticed that Errol Flynn was involved with the Nazi Party and was involved in gun running and some drug and other activity in Mexico. And he happened to therefore stumble on documents as a result of his requests during 1978 that then got him in touch with this story. He says, I first came across this fact in 1978 when I was declassifying documents in the course of writing a biography that dealt with motion picture star Errol Flynn's Nazi associations. In the National Archives Diplomatic Records Room, I found numerous cross-references to prominent figures who I had always assumed were entirely committed to the American cause, yet who had been marked down for suspected subversive activities. And he goes on and tells a story about what he then found. And we don't need to do that here, but again, that's another background source that people may wish to consult. So Harley, I wanted to ask you first of all if you have any comment about what Helga we played from the beginning of Helga's speech, or about any of what I just referenced.
Well, let me say something about what Helga said and the significance of the Schiller Conference. This occurred at a point where we're being told that the whole world is united against Putin's barbarism. And that's what the media says repeatedly, that there's a unity behind the United States and the United Kingdom and NATO to defend Ukraine from the terrific barbarism of Putin and the Russians. Now, the fact is, as Helga pointed out, we had over 60 nations represented at our conference. But you can also look at the votes that took place in the United Nations when they tried to kick Russia. They did kick Russia off the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations. But 94 nations voted to expel the Russians. 100 nations voted against it, abstained, or didn't vote. And those nations that were opposed to getting rid of Russia included the largest nations in the world in terms of population: India, Russia, China, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, I think 20-something countries in Africa. So the idea that there's a unity behind the policy of the West to arm Ukraine to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian is a fraud of the Western media. And at our conference, we had people from many nations discussing an alternative, which is how do you achieve a cooperation which is based not on the unipolar needs of one group, namely Wall Street and London, but on the urgent needs of the entire planet, where we have close to 1 billion people facing very serious food insecurity and possibly facing starvation over the next months, in part as a result of this continuing war, but also because of the indifference of the most powerful nations, which have done nothing to allow the former colonial nations to develop as they should have naturally developed. So that's what this idea of a new security and new financial architecture is about. Not giveaways, but acknowledging that as a result of past injustices, we have a responsibility to help right those wrongs, but the best way to do it is to provide the technology and the productive capability and to stop the suffocating of countries under conditionalities by the international banks. So I think this idea of a new security architecture and a new financial architecture is supported by the vast majority of people in the world if they know about it. And I would argue that in the United States and Europe as well, if people actually understood what we were just discussing about this question of the source of fascist policy coming from the bankers and corporate cartels of London, Wall Street, the European Union, if they understood that and then saw the alternative that we're presenting, I think we would have by far the vast majority of the world's population. Now, a final footnote on that. You know, the idea of democracy, which is shouted about all the time by Biden, by Blinken, by the Western countries. Here's what they think of democracy. When people went to vote in Hungary a little more than a week ago, 2/3 of them voted to keep the current government of Viktor Orban in power. So that was a democratic vote. Orban is considered to be pro-Russia. He's against the sanctions against Russia. And so immediately the European Commission, lovers of democracy, protested the vote and pledged more money for the opposition in Hungary. So in other words, they're going to provide more money to the opponents of the majority of the Hungarian people in the name of democracy. That's the same hypocrisy that escalated the crisis in Ukraine with the regime change coup carried out by neo-Nazi units, working with the U.S. State Department, George Soros, the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S., the British Foreign Office, and so on. when they pulled off the coup in Ukraine in February 2014. So, to hear them talk about democracy and then in the same breath pledge money to the minorities to overturn the democratic vote in Hungary, that's the kind of arrogant, self-centered, self-righteous nature of the so-called rules-based order.
Okay, so here's we have several questions coming in. Let me just go to this one first. This is from Ernie, who states this and says, Lyndon LaRouche in his 2009 article, Economics as History, described what he called the type B personality. Could you relate that to Rathenau's extraordinary capabilities manifested in his diplomacy? So that's his question. Let me just indicate for people who don't know something about Rathenau is his father, of course, founded AEG. We mentioned that, but he was personally an engineer. He had his PhD in physics. He was a musician, played piano. He was also an artist, as in a portraitist. He was also a journalist, and he wrote several books. Anyway, just to say that, so that's one of the reasons the question is particularly interesting. And he was, in fact, the only Jewish person of Jewish extraction, I think, that has ever been a cabinet official in the history of Germany. So, yeah.
Well, the only thing I would say is that this idea of a sense of purpose from history is best developed in people who study science and study classical culture. And that's a central theme of Lyndon LaRouche for many, many years, that it's in the process of scientific hypothesis that you find the true nature of man. Someone who's not satisfied with the existing set of axioms or the traditions, and who looks beyond them whenever there's an anomaly in science that appears, looks to the anomaly, actually is always searching for the anomalies to test the existing state of knowledge, and then is capable through their imagination to come up with new hypotheses to get us closer to the truth of the universal physical processes which characterize our universe. Now, the same thing is true in the arts, in music, in painting, in sculpture. The ability to work from a standpoint of a nonlinear creative capability to resolve problems or tensions that emerge in any existing set of axioms. And so when you look at the character of Rathenau, what you see is the kind of personality who's driven not by ego, not by personal gain, but by this higher universal sense which is associated with Schiller's idea of the sublime. Now, contrast that with the average politician today, who spends most of their time figuring out how to line their pockets, make headlines, and become popular with the in crowd. This is where you see the roots of tragedy. And so that's really what I would say about that. The interesting thing is that Rathenau is part of a tradition that goes back to Moses Mendelssohn in Germany, before the emancipation of the Jewish population of Germany. And Mendelssohn insisted that the way that the Jews could achieve full citizenship in Germany would be as citizens of Germany as well as Jews, but not forming small, self-isolated communities, but recognize the validity of the external world and the comments and the studies that are done by people who are outside of the religion. And it was that kind of universal thinking in Mendelssohn which laid the basis of the Yiddish Renaissance, which created some of the best-known comedians, the Jewish comedians in the United States, but also intellectuals in science, musicians, and so on. So Rathenau is part of that tradition, and that's really where we should be putting our emphasis in culture and education. in developing the ability to relive the discoveries of previous generations of scientists and artists in the minds of every child, so that they can develop the sense of confidence that in their imagination they possess the ability to create a better future.
Okay, we have something we're going to bring up, Harley, for you to respond to. This is pertaining to your discussion about the green policy and this idea of the difference between what is meant in different parts of the world by the notion of green. This is a quote from the Green Reader. This is a document that came out in 1991 and was edited by Andrew Dobson of the University of Kiel, Great Britain, and we're going to run it on the screen. There may be a couple of typos in the transition on the poster, but we'll put it up there. So I'll read it now. Unless extremely implausible assumptions are made, there is no chance of all people ever rising to the levels of material affluence enjoyed by Americans in the late 1970s, let alone to the levels Americans will reach if growth in material living standards continues. The corollary is that people in developed countries today are affluent because they are hogging scarce and dwindling resources. Our way of life is only possible for the few who live in developed countries, as long as we go on securing and consuming most of the materials produced each year. If we shared resources equally, the average American would have to get by on less than 1/6 of the present average energy now used. If these arguments are valid, it follows that our affluent way of life is highly immoral, and that we in rich countries must accept the idea of de-development. We should take immediate actions toward reducing our material living standards in order to permit the third world to have a fair share of the available resources and to permit more of the third world's productive capacity to be geared to the needs of its people. And that was written by a particular individual whose name is not indicated there, named Ted Trainer, who's one of the several authors, including Aldous Huxley and others, of different essays in this book, The Green Reader. Obviously, that's loaded with a whole lot of different forms of assumptions and prejudices, but I figured I'd let you respond to that as you care to.
Well, that's the state of mind that Lyndon LaRouche attacked in his book, There's No Limits to Growth. And he first started identifying this in the mid to late 60s, around the emergence of when the so-called environmental movement was beginning. But even before that, you mentioned Huxley. Well, Aldous Huxley was a key figure in that. Lawrence Rockefeller of the Rockefeller Group, they started promoting in the 50s and 60s this idea of scarcity of resources, limits to growth, the idea that you have to redistribute the world's wealth, and on and on and on. Now, what's left out of that is precisely what we've been talking about, human creativity. The reason we were able to increase the living standards in the advanced sector was not simply pillaging the world. In fact, the people who pillaged the world are the ones who came up with this green ideology. The actual basis of wealth was scientific and technological advance, the ability to take what for primitive societies is not a resource and turn it into a resource. And we're not even touching the beginnings of that capability. If you look at the potential of nuclear fusion to produce a virtually unlimited supply of electricity for thousands of years into the future, you look at the Chinese thinking about mining helium from the moon to bring it here to work with their fusion program. You look at the development of virtually any resource that we have. Every resource, when it's first discovered, is ultimately limited in that eventually, if you just continued to use it or increased its use, you'd eventually run out of it. So a society evolves and develops by constantly defining new resources. And that's a product of individual human creativity. And then the application of, or the creation of new technologies using those scientific discoveries. So the whole idea of the Green Revolution is premised on a fraud, which is that there are limited amounts of materials that can be used to provide for the means of life. You know, one perfect example of this was the Green Revolution in India, where you had, under the British Empire, periods of famine and starvation. And applying American agricultural methods, the periodic famines were ended. And India now is a net supplier of grains. I just read the other day that Egypt has asked and received from India the right to purchase grain from India to make up for what it's going to not get from Ukraine. So this is just a fundamental hoax. And I would encourage people to pick up the book by LaRouche, There Are No Limits to Growth, to read the full refutation of this kind of silliness that comes from the quotes that you had. But again, let me just remind people, this is the essence of Klaus Schwab's argument about the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, that the world cannot have a U.S. standard of living. In fact, the desire for that is what's causing global warming. This is what Barack Obama told young people in South Africa when they said they wanted an American style of living. And he said, no, if you get that, the planet will boil over. So it's these elites, so-called elites, these puppets and paid operatives of the British Empire who promote the same Malthusian policy as Adam Smith and the British East India Company at the time of the American Revolution. And the refutation of that was the Hamiltonian economic system, which demonstrated the ability, based on how you generate credit and how credit is utilized, that you can produce a real surplus so that you can constantly have growth and for improvement of standard of living for a growing number of people, which Lyndon LaRouche identified as the potential relative population density in his economic theories.
Okay, this is a question for you from Adam. And so he asked this, and I think I'm going to add something to it. But I want his question to be stated as he stated it, as it's written. It says, a question for Harley in light of Easter. Surely the majority of humanity can overthrow the corrupt present system by having the right solutions and connecting to forces of light and God. He may have meant good, can't tell, but he said God. Also, thus point out that obviously this is a convergence of Passover and the Easter season and Ramadan. So we're, of course, talking about monotheistic religions. Of course, there's a lot of people in the planet that are of different theological persuasions, and some people are not of any theological persuasion. So when you talk about the majority of humanity, I think you have to qualify that in that sense, because it's important to recognize that there are a myriad of beliefs, not meaning that they are not necessary for some of those people, but meaning that there's a real issue of how you get the right solution across to the majority of people, especially when you consider that problem. So, Harley, that's the question. Again, I'll repeat it so that my editorialization didn't confuse anything. Surely the majority of humanity can overthrow the corrupt present system by having the right solutions and connecting to forces of light and God.
Well, theoretically, that's right, but it hasn't happened. And that's not just because the right answers are not out there. It's because we're dealing with an evil that most people don't recognize. You know, one typical example of this is that there are people who still write comments on the daily updates that I do saying, why do you talk about the British Empire? The British Empire stopped existing in the 1920s or the 1890s or the 1950s. Well, the British Empire is not a physical location. It's not a set of islands or properties or countries. It's an ability to control the way people think. What we sometimes talk about is the empire of the mind. If you can control the way people think about themselves and about human nature, then you can control them. The perfect example is the person who claims to be a Christian but says that man is intrinsically evil. But the mission of Jesus Christ was to essentially show that we can all overcome the one thing we have in common, which is that we're all going to die, that we can all achieve an immortality through our existence by living for the good or for God. And so I think this question is that first of all, you have to know where the source of the problem is. What is the source of it? And everyone says, well, it's within us. Well, we have within us also this potential for the sublime, this desire to have a life of meaning. I don't know of any parent who wishes to see their children suffer. I don't care what religion they are, unless they're severely mentally incapacitated. Every parent wants the best for their children. Now, how do you achieve that? Well, that's the issue that we're addressing in terms of what we've put together on how real physical economy works, because the solution to this problem, including the resource problem, is credit. The essential feature of a functioning economy is that you can allocate resources to those areas of an economy which will produce a surplus. And what are those areas? Physical goods production, scientific advance which enables you to increase the productivity of every person who's employed, and to have a credit system which allocates resources for that, whether it's durable goods or capital goods production as one side of it, distribution of goods is another side of it, the education system, the healthcare system. These are all things which can be worked out if you have people of goodwill and sovereign nations working together. The reason it doesn't happen is because the preponderance of power at this point is in the hands of people who control the corporate cartels, including the media cartels, the financial cartels, and others, who won't allow this kind of credit system to be implemented. So our job is to give people an understanding of, first of all, who's opposed to the well-being of the human race, the majority of humanity, and what their vulnerabilities are, and what the solutions are. Now, we've already done a lot of that work. That's what the conference last weekend was designed to start, a process of building toward convening a conference that will take up this question of a new strategic and financial architecture. So what I would say is that, look, it's not utopian to do what we're talking about doing, but it takes a lot of work. It takes courage. It takes study. It takes an empathy for other people to recognize that what fears you have about confronting your own mortality are the fears that everyone else has. And that's one of the important things about this time of year, the convergence, especially of Passover and Easter, the idea of a higher mission of human beings to serve God by acting as an agent of God on this earth to do good for everyone. And I think that's probably what I would say is the most important thing from the ecumenical message. And as I said, I don't think it's just a question of the Abrahamic religions. I think that wherever you go in the world, you meet people who want a better future for their children. So the question is how to do it. And we're moving in that direction. We have some ideas on it. We've developed, because of Lyndon LaRouche's work, programs for every part of the world. So get in touch with us, join our organization, and become a part of this solution.
Okay, although this question is out of order, it's directly on the subject you're talking about now, so I'm going to ask it. And it says this: is the degrowth argument also an attack on religion? Considering that we are now in a holy month, the major religions of the world all agree that man has domain over the earth and is greater than an animal. Interesting question. What is it about the idea that man is so great that is so intimidating to the enemy? Why should that not be embraced by all? Why is that idea not embraced by all?
Well, Dennis, as your theological bent, you may be able to give a better answer than I can to that one. But I would simply start by saying what I just said before. The fear of confronting our own death, our own mortality, that's one of the things that's played upon. That if you don't do the right things, if you don't go to the right school, you don't get good grades, you don't propitiate the right people, your life won't be so good. And the desire to have an easier life where things are given to you, that's what's played upon by the enemy in saying, we can make your life better if you go along with us. And then you see things like people who do stand out and make a difference. Over my shoulder is the poster of the Free Julian Assange. Here's someone who risked everything to tell the truth. And look where he is. He's rotting in a prison, and the Biden administration is about to get a ruling shortly to bring him here to stand trial for what? For publishing documents from the from U.S. officials showing that they were lying about the human rights violations of the U.S. in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you can take someone who tells the truth and destroy their life, that sends a message to virtually everyone else in the society. Now the question is, do you then stand up for that person's right to tell the truth on behalf of all of us? Or do you submit and say, well, it's too bad what they're doing to him, but I can't do anything about it? So I think there's this fear that I don't want to risk something. And what people don't realize is they're risking everything by not living as they should live. And the reminders that we have from religion, but also on the secular side, what is our Constitution? The preamble, that it's for ourselves and our posterity that we do these things. So I think there's a profound set of ideas that everyone has access to on some level, but needs a kick in the butt to be reminded of from time to time. And that's the function very often of artists, to present in a very not quite sensuous way, but in a way that plays on the higher consciousness of people, this idea that we have this human responsibility to each other and to our Creator, and that's how we should live.
Well, Harley, we have another question for you, but in terms of what you referenced, I'll just indicate something for people. Since today is the day before Easter, there was a famous bishop of Milan named Ambrose. He became well known in history because of his recruitment of Augustine, but he should be as equally well known for his work in theology. It's a little tough to organize Christianity when you're in the middle of the Roman Empire and it's collapsing, and you don't really know who's sort of going to show up on the doorstep the next day. And Ambrose was threatened at various times with being killed, sometimes from Rome itself, sometimes from the barbarians at the gates, as they say. And so his practice of religion was to present the most advanced philosophical ideas directly to congregations that were largely illiterate. I mean, obviously some people were literate, but during the Holy Week, that is the equivalent of to this week of Palm Sunday to now, he presented 9 homilies in the year 380, probably. Well, no, probably the year 387. It could have been 389. Nobody exactly is sure. And then the last one of those that he gave, which was on Saturday, he had this to say. He said, "We share in fact, with the rest of living beings, the ordinary senses, but they do not make use of them in the same way that we do. The cow raises her eyes to the sky, but she is unaware of what she sees. This is true also of wild animals and birds. All living things have the same liberty to see, but man alone has the will to interpret what he perceives. He gazes at the rising and the setting of the celestial signs. He sees the glory of the sky and marvels at its starry orbs. He is aware of the diverse aspect of each star. He knows when the evening and the morning star arise and why they appear at these times. The movements of the constellation Orion, as well as the phases of the moon, are well known to him. He understands how the sun knows the hour of its setting and how it preserves its allotted course with due regularity. He describes all this, the sense of hearing in the same way. He says, man alone of all terrestrial beings is able by listening, reflection, and wisdom to gather the secrets of knowledge. He is able to say, I will hear what the Lord God will speak to me. It goes on like that. Now this is a homily he's giving in the year 387 to 389, which is an extended discussion. The earlier things discussed things from Plato and Pythagoras and all sorts of other theories. And that's what you would hear in his church if you went to his church. Now, one of the reasons that people attack these ideas is because if you were listening to something like that, you would not be a slave. You would not be a subject. You would not be easily baffled or bamboozled. And in fact, if you were listening to sermons of that type, you would not be supporting the so-called Ukraine-Russia war in any way. You would walk away from the entire system. And you would walk away from most of what is on social media. But we don't have that kind of thing being formulated or discussed. And the reason we don't is because the dignity of mankind as a species, of humanity as a whole, and its function and mission in the universe is precisely what is in dispute on our planet today. And I think we can leave it at that because there's other ways in which Harley may want to take that discussion. But I'd just like people to be aware that one factor in this is the general dumbing down of the discussion of the nature and function of God, and what that even means, what the principle means, what the principle of creativity is, the human being's relationship to that principle. And I think that's what makes the idea especially dangerous, because if you start talking about the infinite creativity of the human mind, as that is an expression of the divinity of the universe itself, then you will not be talking about limits to growth. You won't be talking about limited resources. You would recognize that the fact that we know of 2 trillion galaxies, all of which have also various planetary bodies, including satellites of planets, means that the notion of a limited set of resources is an absurdity on the face of it. It's also blasphemous from the standpoint of a rigorous theology. There was a question, Harley, I just wanted to get to from Sarah, who just asked this. This was directed to you, and it says the following. Peace agreements are constantly sabotaged. Does the evil empire know something we don't? Or perhaps they know something they believe to be true that is a fallacy? Do they just fear accountability? And if that is the case, will blanket immunities allow for progress? I think I understand what that means.
Well, let me get to this question that we were just discussing in terms of the what it is they know and utilize. There's this famous line from Cassius to Brutus in Julius Caesar, where Cassius says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Now, this was one of the quotes from Julius Caesar that Lyndon LaRouche pointed to show that Shakespeare understood exactly what he was dealing with in addressing his population at that time. Remember, Shakespeare had written 8 plays on the Plantagenets, the dynasty that ruled England from the end of the 14th century to the end of the 15th century. And this was a period in which feudalism was in its, I guess you could say, its peak. There was barbarism and violence and very little equity in life. And it was a decline of feudalism toward total deprivation. And it was in the midst of this that you had the miracle of the physical discovery of the principle of the nation state, which took place in France under Louis XI around the middle of the 15th century. 1461 is when Louis came in. But it was a direct result of the intervention of Nicholas of Cusa and the Council of Florence in 1437 to 1439, where they put forward an idea of a unity of Christianity, but also a unity of all faiths based on this concept of the living image of God existing in each human being, and that the purpose of a nation must be to encourage and develop that, as opposed to loot the population and treat them as slaves. So if you think about this question of what Shakespeare was writing about, including in the Julius Caesar, where Cassius says to Brutus, who was one of the conspirators against Caesar, the fault lies in ourselves that we are underlings. That's where you see the self-doom of the society, that Brutus, who undertook this action, supposedly to save the country, was doing it for the wrong reason and didn't know what he was doing. And Shakespeare's message to his audience is, look, we emerged from the brutality of the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses, the internecine rivalries and so on of the 15th century as a result of the creation of the nation state under the Tudors. And now, at the end of the 1500s, the beginning of the 1600s, we're seeing a reverse of that. We're seeing under Henry VIII a reversal into this kind of war policy. After Elizabeth, there's no clear line of succession. So Shakespeare was, again, calling on his audiences to reflect on this and not just telling them the story of the history, but the inner psychological workings of what it means to be an underling, that you don't think you can intervene, you don't think you can change it, you don't think your life really matters, and the best you can do is carve out a safe niche for yourself and your family. So that's where real tragic drama takes you out of the individual and the interpersonal relations in the small onto the field of universal history. What things are necessary to know and do, but what quality of character is required to fulfill that responsibility. And I would say this is what the enemy knows. They know that you can reduce people to these small, out of fear, to these smaller goals of personal safety. Look how many good people there are who reject the Great Reset. They reject the whole so-called New World Order, and yet try to figure out how to live off the grid and take care of themselves and their family. That's pessimism about the nature of man. But more importantly, that's being an underling. And I think if anything sticks with people, that quote from Cassius to Brutus, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Maybe that's a useful thing to take from this discussion.
Now, we have several different kinds of questions around what you were talking about on Rapallo. And rather than try to go through each one of them, let me just sort of characterize some of the stuff that people want to know. They understood that what happened in the treaty was that the mutual debts of each country were canceled. But of course, that meant that Russia was canceling the reparations payments, which of course would have sort of called into question the whole reparations system. Then you also mentioned that uh, Germany was recognizing the Soviet Union, and nobody had done that. That got everybody very upset. And that also that France had wanted to even increase the reparations payments on Germany. And of course, then there was also the seizure, somebody referenced the seizure of the Ruhr region by France from Germany and other things. So I guess the basic idea of this was, first of all, people just wanted to get it clear what you were saying. Then the other was someone was asking about comparing the assassination of Herrhausen and Rohwedder to the assassination of Rathenau. Those were, and you might want to say what those are so people know what that reference is. And then someone else was observing that the China-Russia alliance today may be looked upon with the same hostility as the Rapallo Treaty was back in 1922. And or are the same people who hated it, the treaty in 22, the same people that hate what's going on with China, Russia now.
Well, if people are paying attention. Look, the things that I said they had in the treaty, the ending of reparation payments and so on, that was important. But that was not the real issue. The real issue was what it would mean for a cooperation between Russia and Germany in the mutual interest of each nation. Because the Germans wanted to have access to raw materials from Russia that they didn't have. They also recognized that Russia could be a market for the goods that were being produced in Germany that were not being allowed to be exported to Western countries. So there was a mutual benefit there, and Russia wanted German investment and German technical expertise to build up its own economy. So the real threat was not just the threat to the reparations system and to the recognition of the Soviet Union. It was the potential that these countries would show an alternative to geopolitics, an alternative to the idea that their policy should be based on we win, you lose, which is the British Empire. We're going to do things which will benefit us and will hurt you, but if you play along with us, we'll limit the hurt. Whereas the idea of a win-win, which is what Rathenau and Chicherin were offering each other, is different. It's a different conception of statecraft, a different conception of the relations between nations. Now, in that sense, the Russia-China agreement is the same thing. What do people like Friedrich Kemp of the Atlantic Council say? Well, this is really about a mutual defense pact, a military agreement so that they can contest the West. And actually, this came up the other day, a very interesting question when I did a class on Mackinder. And someone said, well, if instead of the British dividing things up and having control, the Eurasian heartland had control, would that be any better? Well, that's the British way of thinking about it. But the actual Russia-China policy, as laid out in the document signed between Xi Jinping and Putin on February 4th, is that they would demonstrate a way of mutual benefit that could be extended to all nations. That's the whole idea of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that's what the British fear more than anything else. They're not just afraid of a new financial system because, look, they've got some pretty clever connivers and swindlers who can figure out how to get on the inside of a new financial system. No, what they don't like is the difference between how credit is determined in an American system, a LaRouchean American system approach versus a British system approach. Who controls credit? Where does it go? The Chinese are interested primarily in increasing the standard of living of their population, and they recognize that the best way to do it is by increasing the standard of living in their neighbors, to increasing the trade potential, the potential wealth that can be increased in neighboring countries that can be an impetus for further development in China and its population, as well as in the neighbor. So it's this idea of cooperation of sovereign nation states, which is the real threat. to the British. And geopolitics is the means they apply to stop it. Now, one of the examples of this is what were they saying to Russia before the Ukraine thing happened? They said to Russia, look, you should fear the Chinese. The Chinese population is so much larger than yours. They're building up their military. You've got a long border with them. China is going to work with you to become the number one country, and then they'll turn on you. This goes back to Kissinger. Kissinger's whole strategy with the opening of China was to pit Russia and China against each other for the benefit of the British-American unipolar system. So it's the break with the unipolar system and the desire to have all nations treated equally as sovereign nation states with rights under international law, not under arbitrary rules of a rules-based order. That's what the fight is all about. Now, I mentioned Herrhausen because there is a parallel here. The assassination of Rathenau was at its heart the attempt to destroy someone who was an extraordinary individual who had a different conception of what Germany could be coming out of World War I. That Germany could be a motor of economic development in a series of cooperative relations with other nations. And that would be good for Germany and good for other nations. Now, in 1989, when Germany was reunified, the whole question was, what would be the nature of East and West Germany, the relationship, and what would be the relationship of a unified Germany to the Eastern countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. Now, it was at that point that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, by the way, Lyndon LaRouche had been put in prison to take him out of the picture. But the people who tried to do it didn't know Lynn. And Lynn was not only not taken out of the picture, he was writing furiously, providing internal memos, documents, global development plans. And Helga was working with these ideas, working with Lynn to realize them. And what was put forward by the LaRouches was this idea of the industrial triangle, that instead of punishing the former Soviet republics and the Comecon nations, take advantage of the fact that you have a skilled labor force, generally decent levels of education, in the case of Russia, raw materials, to figure out how to have a transition from a failed communist state to a modern industrial republic. And to do that, you would extend through rail connection the industrial capability encompassed by the triangle, the rough triangle between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, and have spiral arms of rail bringing capital goods and technology into the areas of the former Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries to enable them to develop. That was rejected. But there was one person who had a similar idea. Actually, there were a few people who had a similar idea. Alfred Herrhausen was the chairman of Deutsche Bank, and he was drafting a proposal for something along those lines for the post-reunification period. Detlef Rohweder was the head of the Treuhand, the trust, which was supposed to be figuring out what to do with the East German industry and how to deal with that after the reunification. Both of them had an idea that these were potential resources that could be developed for the benefit of the people of the East, but also for the benefit of the people in the West. Both of them were targeted for assassination. Herrhausen was killed in the end of November, I think it was, 1989, just shortly after the wall came down, and Rohweder early the next year. And after the killing of the two of them, and there were one or two others who were killed, the interest in this project was lost or was deeply set back. But they were representing the interests of the same kind of industrial networks that were supporting Rathenau in the 1920s. And by the way, the same industrial interests that today are saying sanctions against Russia, including the cutting off of Russian oil and gas and breaking a relationship between German industry and Russia, is a mistake. Now, what's interesting to note is that the supposed assassins of Herrhausen and Rohwedder were, quote, leftist terrorists of the Red Army faction, which was never really proven to exist. And there are real suspicions that this is the same kind of terrorist operation as the so-called right-wing networks that killed Rathenau, the same right-left terrorists that were involved in the terrorism in Italy in the 70s, in Germany in the 80s, and so on. That is, there were deployed networks to kill people who reflected this different conception of statecraft and economics. So I think that's the parallel that I would make in terms of Herrhausen and Rohwedder with the assassination of Rathenau.
Okay, we have something we're going to get a response from you about, which came from Australia, from Tony Kevin, well-known ambassador there. He was ambassador, I believe, to Cambodia at one point and has a distinguished career. He had something that has just been printed in an Australian paper. I'm just trying to get the exact reference here. Just give me a minute. And it's called Lies, Truth, and Forensics in Ukraine, the Case of Bucha. And before we put it up, the introduction by him is, it is a daunting task now, 11 days after the news on the 4th of April of the alleged massacre by Russian soldiers of up to 200 Ukrainian civilians in Bucha. Is a daunting task to now challenge the Russian atrocity narrative. So firmly is it now lodged in the minds of Western readers. It seems to have already passed beyond fact into realms of legend or of folklore. And then he had this statement, which we're going to put up on the screen. He says, I assert that Ukraine's present government, centered in Kiev and Lvov, is now so extreme nationalist in its avowed ideology and style of governance that it can fairly be described as a kind of fascist or Nazi regime. Under its governance and under the pressures of an increasingly cruel and desperate war, Ukraine is reverting to savagery. Yes, I know President Zelensky is of Jewish ethnicity, but this is politically irrelevant. The important thing is that he is the puppet and mouthpiece of a thick layer of extreme nationalists. Ukro-Nazis may be the justified term, who are now strategically embedded into Ukrainian government, the armed forces, and the police at all levels, such that they are in a position to drive Ukrainian policy and governance. As a result, Ukraine is rapidly descending into cruel and hateful behavior toward Russians and toward its own country, its own people. It is ceasing to be a civilized country. So comment upon that, Harley, that just came out today.
Well, I would completely agree with the sentiment expressed there. And I think on the question of how you deal with it, look, we were told slam dunk, Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We were told slam dunk, the Assad government was using chemical weapons against its people. We were told it's proven beyond a doubt that Putin was trying to assassinate the Skripals using Novichok, a deadly chemical weapon. There's one after another of these narratives. Now, some of them have been proven to be false even from the beginning. That doesn't change the narrative and the fact that they still are being presented by the people who are committed to these regime change policies. So, the question is not is the narrative true or false? The question is showing what's the intent of this narrative. Now, I think in terms of the Bucha case, the question was posed by a number of countries at the United Nations. What about due process? What about due diligence? What about evidence? Scott Ritter, who knows something about chemical weapons, particularly said, where was the investigation? The fact that the UN would be willing to turn this over to the Ukrainian prosecutor general to investigate, when we know the actual political nature of Ukrainian prosecutor general, going back to the time when Biden ordered the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor. How do you put trust in that system? So the task here is, as the ambassador's comments show, is to go above that. What's the actual nature of the evil we're fighting? And in this case, it is that Ukraine is being used as a puppet state against its own national interest. Its national interest would be to have a civilized relationship with Russia. How can you have a civilized relationship with a neighbor when you have been butchering ethnic Russians for 8 years living in your country? That is, the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian Nazi forces have been bombarding the Donbas region, which has a significant portion of ethnic Russians. Over 14,000 people have been killed there, the vast majority civilians who are of Russian origin. The laws of the Kiev government after the 2014 coup were designed to discriminate against the Russians there. So it's completely self-evident that there is a policy against the Russian population in eastern Ukraine. So when you look at this nature of the Ukrainian state, instead of negotiating in good faith with the Russians, instead of relinquishing the desire to become part of a NATO force which is targeting Russia, instead of living up to the agreements it signed to negotiate in good faith with the people of the Donbass, instead it's continuing to conduct a war and to demand more force from the West to be able to defeat Russia. And then you have, on the other side, the Biden, Boris Johnson, the British mercenaries involved in this, and everyone else who are committed to this being a long war to drain Russia and create a regime change inside Russia. So what the ambassador is saying is indisputable. But what's even more indisputable is who are the victims here. The Ukrainian people are the victims of its government's policy, which to some extent has been forced on it by NATO, by Boris Johnson, by the people running the Biden administration. And so it's by exposing that and showing how the coup in February 2014 was never about freedom and democracy and prosperity in Ukraine. All you have to do is look at the economic policies imposed on Ukraine after the fall of communism, which were pretty bad. They were just like the Russian policies against Russia of looting. But after 2014, they were even more extreme in destroying the physical economy of Ukraine. So if you're doing that to Ukraine from the West, what would stop you from sacrificing a large portion of the Ukrainian population in a long war against Russia? And that's where you see the betrayal of the Zelensky government of the people of Ukraine. That's where you see the fraud of the argument that we're standing up for the freedom of the Ukrainian people and they're so courageous and so bold. We love them so much. We're going to give them more weapons to make sure more of them are killed. We love them so much. We're going to continue to arm the Nazi battalions responsible for the murder of people in Donbass and probably responsible for some of the atrocities they're saying were committed by Russians. So I think this is a perfect example of where you have to go to the bigger picture. Who benefits from these narratives? Who pushes these narratives? What's the goal of these narratives? And the target of these narratives is the people of the West, to say to them, we can never have peace with Russia or with China. We have to be prepared for war with them. As the 2017 National Security Document of the United States military said, we are now back in the era of great power challenges against revisionist Russian and Chinese governments in which we may need to use nuclear weapons. That's in the National Security Doctrine that was adopted in 2017. So that's where you find the truth. What is the intent of the people who are making up these stories? Now, if there are these atrocities, and these are people who have been killed, it's important to find out who did it. But you can't assign that task to the Ukrainians who are being deployed to destroy Russia and Ukraine. You need independent verification with real evidence, real investigation. And that's not what the United Nations is doing. So on all counts, I would say that the ambassador's comments are accurate, but the question is looking at this from the standpoint of who benefits from these narratives.
All right, and just so background so people have this, Tony Kevin was a professional Australian diplomat from 1968 to 98 for 30 years. He was ambassador to Poland in 1991 to 94, so that's in the period immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and to Cambodia from 1994 to 97. He's the author of 4 published books and an emeritus fellow at the Australian National University. So that's just who he is. That's the background. So when I asked that question. All right, so now we're in the final moments now, Harley. There have been a couple of other questions. I'm going to ask them because people did ask them. But what I'd like to do is have you summarize or use the occasion, maybe not by directly answering these questions, but go into our kind of our final moments for today. So there's a question from Oswaldo who's asking about Masonry. And he asks, does the International Masonic Lodge represent the political side of Western financial institutions in the takeover of the sovereignty of nations? And then he has some note about that the Masons, he says, were founded in London at the same time as the British Empire. I would point out that that's not accurate, and became very influential in a hidden way and have been in all revolutions since 1717. There was also a follow-up just query from Sarah, who just asked the question, why does the empire fear cooperation? That was simply what she wanted to know. So we haven't gotten to everything from today, but that's pretty much everything from today. And so if you want to take those up or just say something somewhat different in summary, please go ahead.
Well, let me take up Sarah's question, because that's really the central issue. What is it about cooperation that an empire would oppose? An empire, by its nature, is an assertion of a coalition of interests that they have the one way that things should be done. It's what a unipolar order is, that everything is for the benefit of the empire. Now, what is an empire? It's not a republic. It's not a government representing the interests and needs of a people. An empire is a coalition of special interests who band together to set up institutions that protect those special interests over and above the other interests of people in that nation and over and above other nations. The idea of a sovereign nation itself is a threat to an empire, because it's asserting the right of a government to defend its population against the looting that an empire necessarily would carry out for its own benefit. So when you have a cooperation, you have nations that are saying, whatever else we did in the past, we recognize today that the improvement of conditions for your people and the improvement of conditions for our people are integrally related. And therefore, we will work with you in cooperation to benefit both your nation and our nation. That was the idea of the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, to overcome the idea of empires having a supreme power over the determination of local governments. Now, in essence, the documents that are behind the Green New Deal, the Great Reset, and so on, the World Trade Organization policy, the global free trade, all of them are designed to undermine the power of sovereign nations to act for the interests of their people. And what we're told is that when a nation wants to do it, it might be an autocratic or authoritarian nation. And therefore, it's a legitimate target for the unipolar world to destroy. So this is what we're dealing with and have been dealing with since the time of the American Revolution, when the founding fathers of the United States decided that for the interests of the people of the United States, they would form a union that, even though different colonies had certain different interests, their common interest was the ability to develop the potential of the land that they had, the people that they had, against an outside imperial force. That's the tradition of the American Revolution. And when you ask the question about what is an empire afraid of, the British Empire never got over the anger at the American Revolution, the impudence of the colonies asserting that they had an equal right to the development, or they had, in a sense, a superior right to the development of their land and their people than an outside force of private interests as the British Empire was and is. So what we can learn from looking back at this history that we've discussed today, and again, the importance of the Treaty of Rapallo, is this was a moment where there was a way out that could have been supported had we had leadership in the United States that understood this, that could have been supported by Republican forces in France, Italy, and elsewhere, but wasn't. And the predominant power at that time was the Franco-British alliance, which saw a German-Russian cooperation as a potential existential threat to their control after World War I. We have the same situation today, only this time it's not just Russia and China. It's the whole of the former non-aligned nations, the former colonies that know very well what it means to submit to an empire. So I think we have the majority of mankind on our side, but we have an education process to do, and that includes an education process in the Western countries themselves, which are the targets of this Anglo-American imperial policy. So I think that's why it was important for us to look back on the Treaty of Rapallo 100 years ago today and realize that we are not without options, but that this time we cannot allow it to slip through our fingers.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Harley, for today's presentation and discussion. And just to say, if people have further questions, we do encourage that you ask those questions and we'll get back to you with answers. Harley does answer a lot of questions. So we can just put that scroll again, the questions bar, so people know where they can send their questions. And that's what we'll do. Also, we would encourage that people would go on and take a look at our conference from last week. I mean, it was an all-day conference. So there's a lot of material there, many speakers. That conference was to establish a new security and development architecture. We'll probably have a link that we'll put up there again, just so you can do that. We have a petition that also has been circulated, calling for the exact same thing, and we are going to continue circulating that. We're looking in particular to have a dialogue with historians, former diplomats, presently serving persons in government, of course, but also people who are school teachers, people who are trying to, in some fashion, come to terms with the need to become acquainted rapidly with elements of history that are going to inform judgments that they're going to need to make about their lives in the short term. Because we can't simply allow what we are presently careening into to cause the whole human race to stumble into the greatest conflagration in history. That's not something which is neither responsible nor is it necessary. And the fault need not lie in ourselves that we are underlings. We can actually change that circumstance. And that's what we invite you to join us in doing. That's what we do through the LaRouche organization and the various international expressions of it. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank everybody for listening today, invite you to participate in the work. As if you are celebrating Easter or you're celebrating any element of the monotheistic religion's holidays, we wish you all the best in pursuit of the apprehension of the infinite. I'll put it like that. Some of you know that recently, just this week, the planet Neptune suddenly surprised everybody by revealing that over the past 18 years approximately, we've had a process there. Neptune has a summer that goes for 40 years. And so it's in the middle of summer now. It's been since 2005 in the summer season. So it's 17 years into the summer. So it's almost midsummer. And what's happening on Neptune is that instead of getting warmer, it's getting cooler. But that happened between 2005 and 2018. It was in the southern hemisphere in particular. Now what we have discovered is that over the course of the 2 years between 2018 and 2020, Neptune suddenly got warmer by something like 9 or 10 degrees. And so these are anomalies that make no sense to the general theories of astronomy and of climate that people have held. It gives us pause and reflection to recognize that the wonder is in what we do not know. And our intelligence is located in what we do not know, not what we do know. It's the fact, as Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa put it, that we pursue a learned ignorance that allows us to move forward and humanity to move forward. And so when considering questions of either the universe itself as a whole or the infinite, it's always a good idea to think about the idea that the paradoxes that we encounter are the way to spur us to divest ourselves of axioms that are not only not helpful, but are actually the opposite of knowledge. And so we want to get people to move away from that. And that's something that the conference of last week was intended to do. By convening the world, over 60 nations participated, as we said, and having and hearing from what the world wishes to do. It is that community of principle pursuing that aim of truth that will truly free the world. And so on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next week.